Just like today, ancient Rome had doctors treating the sick, teachers shaping young minds, and skilled workers keeping the city running. They had a surprisingly structured job system, with strict rules and unexpected methods. Their influence still shapes how we work today. But how exactly did they pull it off? The answers might surprise you. It all began with a group of tough warriors who came from simple sheep farming villages. As Rome's military and political strength grew, they took over the trades and markets of their neighbors, taking control of the salt trade, agriculture, and metalwork. The Romans didn't just stop at conquest. They also absorbed and Romanized the cultures they encountered. This meant that the populations they took over actually contributed to the growth of Roman society and the economy. From farmers to poets and soldiers to slaves, every profession played a vital role in ancient Rome's success. In ancient Rome, tradesmen were the backbone of the economy. Thanks to the excavations at Pompeii, we can get a glimpse into the daily lives of these skilled workers. The streets of Pompeii were lined with small shops, often just a single room with a counter and a set of heavy shutters to close up at night. It was here that tradesmen sold their goods and provided services for the local community. Take the Roman shoemakers, for example. These skilled craftsmen didn't just make shoes, they also repaired them, and they were dedicated to their craft, often working and sleeping in the same small room. A shoemaker's workshop was a busy place filled with workbenches, shoe molds, and plenty of thread. Shoemakers weren't the only tradesmen in town. Locksmiths, goldsmiths, and other skilled craftsmen had their own tools and sold handmade goods. Alongside them were retail shops offering mass-produced items from across the empire. In ancient Rome, guilds played a significant role in organizing tradesmen and perfecting their crafts. These guilds, known as collegia, were associations of workers in the same trade who came together to share knowledge, maintain quality standards, and support one another. Unlike later medieval guilds, which often restricted entry, Roman collegia focused more on refining techniques and ensuring skilled craftsmanship. Interestingly, 8 of these guilds were said to have originated during the reign of Numa Pompilius, the legendary second king of Rome. These early trade groups included tanners, cobblers, carpenters, goldsmiths, coppersmiths, potters, dyers, and even flute blowers. These organizations helped shape the economy of ancient Rome by preserving specialized skills and passing them down through generations. As the city grew and new trades emerged, more guilds were formed. Different neighborhoods became hubs for specific industries, with streets dedicated to particular trades, like the Scythe Makers Street mentioned by Roman statesman Cicero. However, as the Roman Republic declined, guilds began to be used for political purposes, leading to their suppression. New guilds were strictly regulated, and most of our knowledge about these organizations comes from inscriptions from the imperial age. How were these ancient guilds different from modern ones? For one, they didn't have an apprenticeship system to train new workers. Also, members didn't use their guilds to fight for better pay or working conditions like labor unions do today. Since slave labor was common, demanding higher wages or going on strike wouldn't have made a difference. Such protests simply didn't happen. And while modern trade unions and professional associations advocate for labor, rights, wages, and benefits, Roman collegia were more about maintaining traditions and social connections within a trade. So instead of focusing solely on work, these guilds functioned more like social clubs, uniting men of the same trade to form friendships and provide mutual support. They offered a sense of belonging and even opportunities for social advancement, especially for the poor, freedmen, and slaves. Within these groups, members could hold office, manage affairs, and gain privileges they wouldn't have elsewhere. Their role in Roman society was significant, and their impact still fascinates historians today. Guilds operated as miniature versions of Roman towns, with their own leaders, ranks, and shared resources. They had magistrates, decurions, and plebs, distributing wealth and benefits according to status. Each guild was supported by a patron, typically a wealthy and influential figure, who helped fund its activities and protect its interests. Guild members would regularly meet for business and festivities, and if they were lucky, they might even have their own hall, scholar, to call home. They'd fill their treasuries with initiation fees, dues, and fines, and on special occasions, they'd march in processions, banners held high. Guilds were more than just social clubs. They were also spiritual groups. Each had a patron god, shared religious rituals, and even a common burial place for members. Then, there were the ancient Roman doctors, the heroes of the empire. While we might assume they just doled out medicine, these medical professionals were so much more. Some physicians were the ancient equivalent of legends, earning top dollar for their services. But how good were their medical skills? Surprisingly, ancient Roman doctors were as advanced as those from just 2 centuries ago. Their surgical expertise came from treating battlefield wounds, making them highly skilled in operations. As for medicine, it was a blend of home remedies, charms, and prayers to the gods of health and healing. In fact, the Roman statesman Cato wrote about these remedies in his book on farming. Who knew that ancient Roman doctors were also skilled in the art of natural remedies? It's clear that these medical professionals were dedicated to healing and caring for their patients, using a combination of skill, knowledge, and creativity. In 219 BC, a Greek surgeon became the first foreign medical expert to arrive in Rome, marking the beginning of a long history of Greek influence on Roman medicine. But who made up the medical workforce in ancient Rome? You might be surprised to learn that many physicians and surgeons were slaves, freedmen, or foreigners, especially Greeks. In fact, the abundance of Greek medical terms still in use today is a testament to their lasting impact. The Romans recognized the value of Greek medical expertise, and leaders like Caesar and Augustus rewarded Greek physicians with citizenship and special privileges, and wealthy Roman households. They even had their own trained physicians on staff. So, what did ancient Roman medical care look like? We can thank medical writers like Celsus and Galen for leaving behind books that give us a glimpse into their methods. And, amazingly, surgical instruments have even been unearthed at Pompeii. Ancient Rome also had its own specialists, including oculists, dentists, and even the occasional female physician. By the 2nd century, many cities had salaried medical officers to care for the poor, and some even provided office space. The Roman army even had its own medical corps, with doctors assigned to the legions. Although there were no formal medical schools, aspiring physicians learned by working alongside experienced doctors, gaining hands-on training in the field. Just as Rome advanced medicine through practical experience, it also revolutionized the legal profession. The Romans are credited with creating the first professional lawyers, and their influence continues to shape legal systems around the world today. But what made Roman lawyers so unique? For starters, they were the first to argue cases on behalf of their clients, rather than having clients represent themselves. In ancient Greece, speechwriters would help clients prepare their arguments, but they wouldn't actually plead their cases. In Rome, however, you had 3 types of legal eagles: the jurisprudents, wise men of law, who analyzed and created laws, and the advocati, men summoned to one side, and causidici, speakers of cases, who argued cases on behalf of their clients. By the 2nd century BC, these lawyers were arguing cases like pros. As the Roman legal system evolved, so did the lawyer class. The most sought-after lawyers were top-notch, wearing immaculate togas and commanding huge fees. They lived large, with luxurious villas in the countryside and elaborate mansions in Rome, complete with waiting rooms for their clients. The Romans were true pioneers in law, laying the foundation for modern legal systems worldwide. Many legal principles they developed, such as contracts, property rights, and due process, are still used in courts today. Much like in the modern world, where high-profile lawyers can achieve fame and fortune, a legal career in ancient Rome was a fast track to prominence and political power, especially for those without influential family connections. But here's the surprising part. Anyone could sue anyone else for anything without any restrictions. This led to some pretty shady tactics, with young politicians bringing frivolous charges just to get their names in the spotlight. On the other hand, lawyers were technically forbidden from accepting payment for their services. But this rule was more like a gentle suggestion, and lawyers found creative ways to get around it. In the good old days, clients would turn to their patrons for legal advice, but later on, lawyers were supposed to be available to anyone who needed them. Many top-notch lawyers took it upon themselves to offer their expertise to fellow citizens, simply as a matter of honor. So, while the system wasn't perfect, it was clear that law and politics were intimately entwined in ancient Rome, and who knows, maybe some things haven't changed all that much after all. Clients who were also thankful for their lawyers' services couldn't be stopped from showering them with valuable gifts. And let's not forget those generous legacies left to successful advocates. It was the ultimate thank you note. Take Cicero, for example, one of Rome's most respected lawyers. He didn't have any other source of income, but he still managed to live the high life. He owned a fancy house on the Palatine, not to mention half a dozen country estates, and spent his money lavishly on art, books, and fine living. But as time went on, the rules against lawyers accepting fees became more like suggestions. Eventually, Emperor Claudius had to step in and set some official fee limits. Of course, corruption was still a problem, just like today. Judges, or praetores, might find ways to supplement their income, but it seems they were too busy, or too proud, to bother with petty bribes. It was the jurors, or iudices, who were more likely to be swayed by a little extra cash on the side. Well, while lawyers were making a name for themselves, teachers were busy shaping young minds. Their education system was a far cry from the classrooms we know today. But who exactly were these ancient educators, and how did they operate? In ancient Rome, formal education was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Kids from rich families had the privilege of learning from private tutors, while those from more modest backgrounds attended primary schools called ludus literarius. These schools were run by teachers known as literatores, or literati, who often flew solo, setting up their own schools and charging parents for their services. There were no fancy school buildings or designated locations for these ludus literarius schools. Instead, scholarly types, called pedagogues, transformed private homes into classrooms, taking in student boarders and teaching them the ways of the world. These teachers were often former slaves or freedmen, and while the job itself wasn't considered prestigious, a talented teacher could earn respect through their character. So, what was it like to be a student in ancient Rome? Let's just say it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Pupils feared their teachers, but didn't necessarily respect them. However, Quintilian, a renowned educator and lawyer in ancient Rome, had some pretty scathing words for the average Roman teacher. In his book, The Institutes, written around 90 AD, he let loose on the state of education. It's a disaster, he basically said. These so-called teachers are either clueless or convinced of their own brilliance, despite being barely qualified. They're like mini-dictators, refusing to listen to experts, and instead forcing their own brand of foolishness on their students. And it gets worse. Quintilian claimed that these subpar teachers weren't just bad for their students' academic prospects, but also for their moral development. He cited the example of Leonides, the tutor of Alexander the Great, who allegedly instilled some pretty bad habits in the young king. Despite the Romans not exactly prioritizing education, they still managed to lay the groundwork for the concept of teaching and learning. But have you ever wondered how ancient Romans learned the skills they needed to succeed in public life? Well, here's the thing. Their education system didn't exactly cover everything. Important skills like law, jurisprudence, administration, diplomacy, and warfare were left out of the formal curriculum. So, how did young Romans learn the ropes? The answer? It lay in a clever system of mentorship. Young citizens would attach themselves to experienced older men who were experts in their fields. By shadowing these seasoned professionals, young Romans gained hands-on experience and learned the ins and outs of public life. It was the perfect way to prepare for the challenges ahead. This system closely mirrors modern internships and mentorship programs, where aspiring professionals work under experienced mentors to gain practical skills. But you see, all these things were made possible due to Rome's impressive government. Can you even imagine Rome without its impressive infrastructure and government? It's hard to picture, right? Well, the Romans knew that to build a thriving society, they needed a solid foundation. And that's exactly what they created. They developed a range of government jobs that might raise some eyebrows today. For instance, there was the curator operum maximorum, essentially the ancient Roman version of a minister of public works. Then there was the curator viarum, who kept the roads and highways in tip-top shape, and the curator statuarum, who made sure the city's public statues were looking their best. Now, let's talk about the wealthy nobility, known as the patricians. They made their fortunes the old-fashioned way, through military conquests and smart investments. They'd use their share of the loot to buy up agricultural land, creating vast estates that were managed by ruthless middle-class farm managers. These managers wielded enormous power over the armies of slaves who worked the land. It was a system that created huge social divisions and limited access to wealth for the common people, known as the plebeians. As you can imagine, this led to some serious social unrest. One notable example is the tragic story of the Gracchi brothers, who dared to challenge the status quo with their land reforms. Their efforts were later championed by none other than Julius Caesar himself. The wealthy patricians looked down on mercantile trade, believing it was beneath their noble status. However, they still wanted to profit from it. To do this, they used middle-class business partners, known as clients, to handle trade on their behalf. This way, the patricians could enjoy the financial benefits of commerce without directly involving themselves in business, which would have been seen as improper for their social class. It was a smart strategy that allowed them to stay wealthy while maintaining their elite status. While trade and commerce were thriving, certain professions we take for granted today didn't even exist in ancient Rome. Take bakers, for instance. It's because they hadn't yet discovered soft grain, and working with spelt grain was a labor-intensive process. As a result, bread making was a do-it-yourself affair, limited to personal use. Fast forward a few centuries, and the introduction of soft wheat revolutionized the Roman economy's food and wine. Suddenly, bread and cakes were all the rage. Another surprise was that ancient Rome lacked smiths. You'd think that, as warrior farmers, they'd need plenty of iron tools and armor. But it seems iron was scarce during the time of Numa, while copper was readily available, thanks to the Etruscan mines. Interestingly, goldsmiths did exist in ancient Rome. The Etruscans, who controlled the river Tiber, supplied the raw materials, and early Roman jewelry featured Etruscan styles with Latin inscriptions. Who knew that ancient Roman bling had an Etruscan twist? But while skilled artisans like goldsmiths thrived, another group played a very different role in Roman society: slaves. As the empire expanded, the number of slaves flooding into the city skyrocketed. We're talking thousands of people being traded like commodities. Slaves could actually gain their freedom and become successful members of society. It was a rare opportunity, but it existed. And get this, some poor plebeians were so desperate for a better life that they'd sell themselves or their children into slavery, just for a chance to climb the social ladder. This social mobility was a key factor in the Roman Empire's success, for a while at least. So why didn't more plebeians, common people, get jobs instead of relying on slaves? Well, it all came down to cost. Slaves were ridiculously cheap to buy and maintain, while paying a plebeian a wage was a much more expensive proposition. As a result, many plebeians were left jobless and reliant on state welfare. The Gracchi brothers had introduced this system, which usually took the form of cheap grain and bread. Sometimes the government would even hand out cash, a practice that Emperor Nero was particularly fond of. Who knows? Maybe he thought it would boost his popularity. Well, it didn't quite work out that way for him. Then, there were some slaves who defied expectations. While many were mistreated and lived in harsh conditions, others were highly educated and skilled in various trades. Imagine having a personal chef or medic who's worth their weight in gold. As time passed, these talented slaves took on more responsibilities, managing households, shops, banks, and even schools. However, it's essential to remember that their lives weren't easy. Many slaves were abused, neglected, or even forced into intimate services. A shocking example of this can be seen in the ruins of Pompeii, where archaeologists discovered that some wealthy villas had secret back entrances for their female slaves to be sold for intimate services. It's a disturbing reminder of the darker side of ancient Rome. Now, here's a fascinating paradox. While being an intimate service worker was considered indecent, owning a brothel was a whole different story. In Pompeii, archaeologists also found a villa with a built-in whorehouse, run by a trusted slave, or libertus, a freed slave. Who knew the ancient Romans were such savvy entrepreneurs? But here's the surprising part. As the Roman Empire grew, laws were enacted to protect slaves' welfare. Why? Not just for moral reasons, but also because slaves were crucial to the empire's economy. Ancient Rome was a society built on rules and reputations. Every job had its own code of conduct, shaping a person's status and success. But not all professions were respected. In fact, some were downright scandalous. Take acting, for example. In Rome, actors were seen as no better than intimate workers. Can you imagine? Yet that didn't stop Emperor Nero from stepping into the spotlight. He was obsessed with performing, singing, playing music, and reciting poetry. Much to the disgust of the Roman elite, his love for the stage embarrassed the upper class, who believed such behavior was beneath an emperor. And then there were the gladiators, both admired and shunned. These warriors were superstars of the arena, winning crowds with their brutal battles. The promise of fame, fortune, and the ultimate adrenaline rush even tempted noblemen and women into the ring. But when Emperor Commodus took it to the extreme, fighting in the Colosseum himself, it raised eyebrows. After all, an emperor playing gladiator was a step too far. Eventually, laws were passed to restrict participation, ensuring that Rome maintained some sense of dignity, or at least tried to. The ancient Romans were ahead of their time. They pioneered the concept of division of labor and understood that different tasks required different skills and responsibilities, laying the foundation for the workforce we rely on today. Thanks to this innovation, we now live in a world where everyone has a role to play. With countless jobs and industries, people can pursue their passions while contributing to society.